Hello, everyone. Derek Floyd here, Beautiful Now Podcast. Welcome to another edition of Beautiful Now Live. Now, this is the segment where I interview special guests about things that are topical and relevant to you, your family, and your community, and that affect your daily life. And if you enjoy this type of content, please do me a favor and pause and hit me with a like or subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell right next to it. This lets me get the most updated content to you as soon as it's available. And if you enjoy this type of content, please share it with a friend. We want to make sure everybody gets to have content that's uplifting, encouraging, and inspiring. Now, today's topic is something that's affected everyone all over, whether you realize it or not. You've seen it in the news, you've heard about it from friends and family, from colleagues, and that is the George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, him getting found guilty on all 3 counts in the court case. This has dragged on for a long time, and many of us, as we saw the court deliver that verdict, we felt a relief, but then we felt a heaviness. We weren't sure where to go from there. Is this case something that's going to be monumental, life-changing, history-making, or just another blip on the radar of racism in our country? Today we want to tackle that very subject and ask the question, after the guilty verdict, what's next? Where do we go from here? What happens after this verdict has been issued? I brought 2 special guests and 2 special vantage points to help us break down in a town hall style what this means to you and your family. One person is a 24-year veteran of the police force, retired now, who's going to give us the perspective of the law enforcement from behind the badge. How does this verdict affect those in blue? The other person is a pastor in Birmingham, Alabama, who's been pastoring for over 24 years. He's going to give us a perspective of what it takes from the clergy side to see how a congregation feels, what they should do, how they should lend this verdict in their own minds. And again, we'll dissect it from all points to be able to truly figure out what's our next step. What is our next move? Is this just a one-step, one-shot thing? Or is this actually the change we're looking for? So please help me welcome my 2 great guests, Mr. Eric Lawrence and Bishop Jim Lowe. Gentlemen, are you there today? Welcome to the program, everyone. So glad you guys could take a few minutes to sit down and talk to the subscribers about this incredibly sensitive topic, the George Floyd murder. This segment is going to be kind of a town hall style where we're going to kind of ask some questions back and forth to get more of a well-rounded perspective on what we can do in our own lives to go forward from this incredible verdict. I don't want this to be a he say or she say or right or wrong. I want it to be just the facts being laid out that we could all make our own decisions, our own concept of what's going to help us in the future to move this racial divide forward. I'm going to go ahead and dive in right with our first guest, which is going to be Eric Lawrence, our law enforcement officer. Let me ask the question here. From a law enforcement perspective, is this going to change how things are done on the police force as a whole? I mean, are people going to still have this overt racism happening in the police department? Will it be more underneath or kind of tucked underneath where people can't see behind the blue wall of silence, so to speak? Will this change the police department where you see? What do you think?
I think there's going to definitely be a curb in racism. I think that from the top down, the chiefs and the mayors and the city managers are going to do what they can to put things in place to try to weed that out initially, to feel people out from the beginning interview process as far as they're getting involved in that specific agency. So I think there will be a curb. And I think that there will probably be people who understand that with the body cams and other mechanisms of recording and evidence out there, that even if there is a heart of racism in them, that they need to do all that they can if they want to retain those jobs, to make sure that that does not reflect in any way to the public, because our nation is just hypersensitive to that right now.
I know a lot of us are thinking, what are the police departments feeling out there on the street, the guys that are out there on the field, because now there's a whole other layer of accountability happening. That our community is saying, hey, we're watching, we see what's happening. You can't just do anything. Is that changing the police department as a whole as well?
Well, there's a whole new level of accountability in place. And at the same time, for, again, the majority of the men and women in blue who go out there to do an honest, decent, hard-working day's work at what they do, I think that now it's kind of put them at a disadvantage. And I think that what I mentioned to you guys earlier, that the record numbers of people with experience who have decided to leave the field, I think that it's going to shortchange everyone, from the community to the men and women in blue who and anticipated staying 3, 4, 5 years longer, who decide that now maybe it's time to get out of the job, I think it's going to cut them short. So it's kind of it's kind of it's a kind of an unfortunate thing all the way around, I have to say, for both the citizenry who get served by the law enforcement professionals and for the actual men and women in blue who serve.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Eric. Pastor, do you feel, just a question for you, do you feel that now, since the verdict, it's okay to tell your congregation, hey, it's all right to be a black man. You don't have to be stressed out anymore. This is all going to be okay now. Or do you feel like, hey, maybe you still need to be careful. This is still not really where it needs to be. It's still sensitive out here. Where do you feel this sits with your congregation? How are you going to share that?
No, sir. Look, this is not the first time we've had situations that have been exploited or taken advantage of. We're going to have that trouble because we are in a fallen society, a fallen earth, and there's still going to be problems. We can go all the way back to laws have been violated. If we go back, we're dealing with the same problem that we had to deal with in America all along. Justice has not necessarily been rendered correctly in every situation. Now, we talk about racism. Racism is going to be with us probably as long as we're here. I don't know if we're going to erase that. It has a lot to do with just sin of mankind. We need to be making sure we're executing a righteous judgment in every situation. So if we tend to this one, we'll miss it somewhere else until we put the Lord at the top of the line and we begin to recognize him from the person that's been victimized to the person that's doing the actions. We're going to have problems. And until we get him first. And I appreciate what Officer Eric is saying, but I don't know if there will be any improvement because there's always still going to be injustice. And until we deal with the root of the problem, which is a heart not right, I don't think it's going to change. Mm-hmm. Do you not realize we've been dealing with this? We talk about racism almost since inception of this country. You know, we've had that. It will not improve until the hearts are improved.
You know, I can definitely see your point there, Bishop. I think where I want to make sure I bring everyone in is that a lot of us have seen multiple murders along the way, multiple situations where there's been racial injustice for African American men. And so we get to one verdict and we get a win, yay, but what happens next? What happens to all the other ones that weren't solved? And does this clear the field for everybody to feel better like we just got one victory? But there's so much more ahead, and I don't want everybody to take a blind eye to the other injustices that have happened and try to bring forth some kind of change now, because this is just one space, but there's a whole lot of work to do going forward, don't you think?
Let me say this, and I want to go back to Officer Eric at the same time. But look, in 64, we passed a civil rights bill. Did that change things? In 1965, there was a voting rights bill. We are still dealing with voters that are being disenfranchised. Just changing the law doesn't change it. We've got to change the hearts of people. That's black and white. That's Asian. That's Hispanic. All of those things have got to be dealt with. I respect the law. I respect the officers. I believe that there are some that are out there that may be racist. But we're looking at a man right now that's an officer. You said how many years? 20 plus years. Am I going to look at him and say he's a racist? This is another black man there. He probably, I don't think there's no way in the world that I'm going to call this black man racist just because he has a uniform. That's not fair. It's not fair to do them like that.
Sure.
Birmingham Police Department right now is probably more African-American in leadership and everything. And yet we have people come out and declare them racist. Something's wrong with that. I'd like for the officer to speak on that line.
I mean, there's a lot of truth to what my brother says, the bishop, about hearts needing to change. I mean, that is optimal. The heart must change, and then the actions are going to be consistent with the heart. I get that. But on the other side, I realize it's almost like, it's almost like an example of, again, affirmative action, which says that regardless of the way you feel about me, that I'm entitled, or I'm going to be placed in certain jobs and certain percentages are going to be black and so forth, so that we can send a visual message to the people in the workforce and even to the little boys and girls watching that these people are entitled to and belong in these positions. Now, even if the heart doesn't change, I would say you're not going to get 100% of what you're looking for, but you're going to get a substantial portion of what you're looking for, because actions in and of themselves will create results or outcomes. So men of color, women of color occupying positions is going to send a message to all of those little boys and girls who may not hear those racist remarks, because again, the actions, which are the verbal words and the verbal expression in some instances, must be quelled regardless of the way the heart feels. So the visual presence, those people actually getting the benefit of those things, the country and these little boys and girls become accustomed to seeing brown and colored faces in these positions of authority, these positions of power, that speaks volumes and it makes a difference. So in the same regard, saying that officers out there are going to be held accountable to treat people the same, or even if you're talking about voters, regardless of the way I feel about you, if I'm forced to and will be held accountable for the way I handle the polls, this is what we're going to do moving forward. It's going to be the same. Then while having a heart consistent with that is ideal, I don't necessarily need that to make progress. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I'd like to
Bishop, go
just
ahead.
come with that. Now, let's think in terms of this country and what we had. We forced on the South, if you would, the freedom of the slaves, and we said the slaves are going to be free. But we did not change the hearts of the individual, nor did we make efforts to do that. That was not done from the church. As a result, we then came up with separate but equal and Jim Crow laws. We did not change the problem. And so here we were back at being discriminated against, again, because of color. When wrong issue, but Brown versus Topeka in 1957, when they said that separate but equal was inherently wrong, then they delayed when we tried to bring school integration in.
Right.
It took almost another 20 some years before that happened. The law was put there. So respectfully, I agree. The laws must be based upon, they need to be issued. Yes, you need to clean out the police force, but you need to clean out a lot of the stuff that's there. But until we get to the root of the problem, respectfully, like I said, Officer Eric, the root of the problem is the heart of mankind. And that only changes with the word of God.
Thanks again, Bishop, for that answer with the clarification, going back into history and figuring out where we came from to get where we're going. Definitely puts it in perspective. But let me shoot this next question to Officer Lawrence. Do you think the verdict actually brings relief to some of the police officers in some of these larger cities like in Miami, New York, LA, Chicago, that type of thing, where they've been seen as the negative, the bad guy in these communities, but now all of a sudden, hey, maybe they're not so bad after all. This relief is going to let them see like a good guy. Like maybe they can trust them again. Can they bring back the trust in those cities where it's been lost for so long? What do you think, Eric?
I think it's going to be difficult for it to bring back that trust for them. I think what it's going to do is in the minds of are you talking about, in the minds
the
of
verdict.
The police, right, the verdict is going to create in the minds of the police officers the sense that the people on the street are going to feel assured that the larger system will hold the street cop accountable for his actions.
Okay.
But it doesn't necessarily change people's thoughts regarding the police officers, the men and women behind the badge doing the job. So what I mean is that the cop on the street now feels as though that the average citizen is going to say, hey, you better treat me right or you know what's going to happen to you. And so while the police need to know that for sure, because I don't tolerate or I don't put up or I don't support garbage from the men and women in uniform any more than a member of the public does. We need to do our jobs and we need to do it fairly and correctly. Okay. But at the same time, we don't need to feel as though that the general public now has us by the throats, basically almost in a threatening manner, and that somehow they hold this power or wield this power that they're going to have our jobs or have our positions or have our freedom if we don't kowtow to what they say or what they want, because that's not going to be tolerated either. So the men and women in uniform are in a difficult situation, because now they're saying to themselves, I have to go out and do this job with the people maybe taking this approach. That's not to say that everyone, even the majority of people, will take that approach. I don't think they will. But I think that the men and women in uniform, when it comes to the system itself as well, that they are not going to be as trusting of the system that's supposed to be there to protect them as well as protect the man on the street. And so they will say, well, if that was an example of the Chauvin case, Derek Chauvin case, where maybe he should have been charged criminally, but maybe was it excessive? The fact that he was found guilty on 3 different charges, is that setting a precedent for my going on the street and doing my job, that they may be quick to try to criminally charge me for something that comes up? So I have to say, am I safe as an officer to go out and do my job? Because now there's been a precedent set that they will be quick, or they will not hesitate to now look at me and try to charge me criminally for everything or anything I do.
Well spoken. I get that. I think that's a well spoken answer. I think a lot of us see the cops in a way where they think they can just do whatever they want to do or say whatever they want to say because they wear the badge. But the way you're explaining it is now that they've been held accountable, so to speak, they are almost nervous, almost anxious, because they feel like everybody's got a camera and everybody's got a grudge. And if they do something wrong, or at least it can be construed to be wrong, they can be held accountable and off to the races in something they didn't even do. This really puts us in an awkward position for the police officers. And I can't imagine being behind the badge trying to figure out, well, do I rush into this situation? Do I pause? How do I react with force or not with force? It definitely puts us in a tough situation. What do you think, Bishop?
Well, no, I do agree with that. I perhaps am a different point of view. Like I said, I'm looking to fix the problem. And I think all we're doing is putting Band-Aids on the problem. And I have an appreciation for an officer that's out there. The public, as Officer Eric was saying, I think the public is going after the police in every area, wherever they are, and saying they need to be restrained. And I don't think that we're being fair with that. And I think the public is generally going to have an attitude, well, you can't do this, you can't do this. And I think a part of the problems we have is that you get a belligerent person in a car when the cop pulls, what you stopping me for? You ain't got no right to stop me. And there's the heart of that person that needs to be dealt with, to respect that officer. And treat that officer like he's a human being, just like the officer needs to treat the person on the other side of the stop as a human being too. And until we get there, we're not going to resolve our problems. And I will not tell my congregation to loosen up. I will tell them, George Floyd, okay, that's good. But when you get stopped, keep your hands on that wheel. Treat that officer. Yes, sir. No, sir. Don't disrespect him. You treat him with the respect that you want to get.
Now, Bishop, that's actually the real key here is that, like you said, treat everybody like you want to be treated, the golden rule, and we seem to completely miss that. We get pulled over and we get stopped and all of a sudden we puff up and we got attitude, and that's not helping anybody. And we're thinking that person's out to get us from the get-go. Maybe we need to just pull back a little bit and kind of figure out how to de-escalate the situation, which is where I lean into you, Eric. I know I've asked you about this before. Cops get out to these situations and it may be heightened. It may be already crazy. Are they truly trained to de-escalate before they escalate a situation? Because it goes right to, let me pull my gun or pull my taser. It seems so fast in these videos we watch. Are they really being trained specifically to, hey, let's de-escalate first? What are they being trained to do?
The officers are trained to be professional regardless of the conduct of the person. I can't control the conduct of everybody within whom I come into contact during the time of my shift or time of my tour of duty, but I can control my actions and my responses to their behavior. So a position of professionalism and firm professionalism is always, while keeping oneself safe, that is always where we start. So we want to make sure that, yes, we de-escalate in a professional manner, because a situation where the officer is able to have that contact with the public, in this situation, we're talking about a common traffic stop. And that's the situation, or that's the scenario where most people have contact with the police, or the average citizen has contact with the police most is through traffic stops. So my point is that that officer would de-escalate the situation, because it's a win-win situation when an officer can drive away from that traffic stop, having conducted the business he needed to conduct without tempers really flaring, and definitely without any type of violence occurring, regardless of whether or not the officer was in the wrong or the officer was in the right. Even if the officer's in the right, it's not the heart of any chief of police or even any solid officer on the street to have to be involved in a violent encounter.
But what do you do when you, okay, that was a traffic stop, but then you go on a deal where there is domestic violence, for instance. And those are the most challenging ones, I think you would agree. And you've got emotions very high, and you're talking about de-escalation. I think the general public and our politicians are being unfair to a lot of our officers, and that they're putting constraints on them and trying to put things on them that they as human beings themselves would not be able to endure under. You go to a domestic violence situation, you don't know. You go in there sometimes, and I'm just having been a chaplain with the police force before. You go in there, and you got someone being abused, beaten, and all. And then that person that's gotten beaten, when you go in to arrest the one that's caused the problem, then that one that's been abused turns on you. And then now you can't do this. It's hard to diffuse situations when people's attitudes have been set up according to politicians saying, defund the police, beat the police, arrest the police, and send them to jail, burn them up, and all this.
I agree wholeheartedly with the bishop. There are people who sit down and they read over a piece of paper about a situation that happened weeks ago or happened in history about a police officer and how he handled, let's say, as the bishop said, a domestic violence situation. And they want to sit there and take an hour to come up with an opinion regarding what the officer's action should have been. When all of these things were happening within seconds, where this officer was having to deal with real violence, both to himself or herself and to innocent people on the scene. And I commend that officer in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, for rolling up on the scene where the one female was attempting to stab another female to death. And that officer did not hesitate because of the political climate, but that officer pulled his gun, fired, shot the person. The person died as a result of their injuries, which was unfortunate, but they were able to stop that person's murderous acts from killing this other young woman. But unfortunately, rather than being hailed as a hero, hey, you prevented one individual from killing this teenage woman who had her whole life ahead of you, and she was being in the process of being murdered by another person, and you stopped it so that her parents would be able to see her, hopefully, for as long as possible. And if we want to be politically correct to talk about the politics involved, you stopped a Black woman from being killed. So you have a white officer defending the life of a young Black woman to prevent another person from murdering that young Black woman. But that officer is not hailed as a hero. The officer is condemned by the likes of LeBron James and many people in the public because the individual committing the murder or the attempted murder was also a Black woman. So that's the trick bag the officers put in. So the question is, should the officer have allowed this young Black woman to be stabbed a couple of times and then taken action so that that officer could prove that that officer's actions were necessary to stop the woman with the knife? Or do you do like you're trained and say, before it gets to that point where this young woman is stabbed, my duty, my job, I'm being called and paid for me to jump in and for me to, if I need to, use violent force to stop her murderous actions. Those are the tough situations with which the officers on the street are faced, where now their decisions may be slower because of these cases because the officer says, I don't want to find myself under prosecution. So maybe I should allow this young woman to be stabbed a couple times so that I will be justified in everyone's mind when I take action to use force to stop this murderous person who's trying to kill her.
Bishop, what do you think?
Now, if you'd been in that situation, would you have shot the person that's getting ready to stab this young black woman? Would you? You don't. You know, we're Monday morning quarterbacking, but do you think his response was appropriate? Maybe you can give me a straight answer to that. Do you think it was appropriate?
Yes, as a matter of fact, from everything I've learned since I've been involved in law enforcement and use of force in response to subject resistance, everything that I've learned said that this was a textbook, clear-cut case of a proper use of force in order to stop the illegal actions of another person.
Which is what I'm bringing us to the point of. You are an African American. You agree, having been trained with respect for human life and with respect for African American lives as well as all lives, you would have done the same thing. So what makes the difference in this case that we're going to slander or condemn this officer who's following what he's been trained to do, and the training is right? I am saying, once again, we are looking at this thing from one side. We need to look at it. The Bible says to execute righteous judgment. And that means to correctly ascertain what the situations are and then make a decision. So if it had been you, we probably wouldn't get people saying anything negative about it. But then again, because you have the uniform on, sir, they probably would have condemned you also. I'm saying we are not being fair. The George Floyd, I agree with the verdict on that.
My question is this. I'm sorry. Can I speak to that before you move on?
Yes.
To that? And that is, if it had been the young lady's father who arrived at the scene and pulled a gun and shot this girl who was trying to kill his daughter, would that have been okay?
And well, in my case, I would say yes. I mean,
okay, let me ask you another question. So the young lady's father, the young lady who fell to the ground, who was being stabbed, do you think her father has a problem with the officer?
No, I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't.
Okay,
I don't care if he's white, Hispanic, Asian, or what. You protect my daughter, I appreciate you.
So you have a black man who is happy tonight because this white officer protected the life of his daughter.
He did what he was trained to do.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Protected life with the use of force. And that's what the officers are trained to do. And that's what I would have wished anyone, if it were my daughter, and I have 4 of them, I would have wanted someone with a gun at that moment where there was no reasoning, there was no way to grab this woman because it's happening too fast, and this officer is several feet away, for this officer to pull out his gun and fire at that woman in order to stop her from shooting that girl. If it was one of my 4 daughters who was being stabbed, I would have, it didn't matter whether it was a police officer or the man on the street or my daughter's boyfriend or whomever. I would be appreciative of that person who saved my daughter's life.
I hear you two discussing this at length here, and I do believe this is something that should be kind of brought to the forefront, but I want to kind of bring us back to focus about the verdict and how this is directly affecting our life. Again, though, with this particular case with 2 teenagers, one with a knife and trying to stab each other, the whole situation is tragic, and teenage violence is a whole nother segment we could go into, but I want to make sure, and I appreciate that you brought it up, but I want to circle back and make sure I get this to the verdict, because this is what people are asking about. So let me get to the heart of that and make sure we clear that up. So thank you, though, for bringing that up. It is a tough subject. Let me get this last question to Eric. I'll check my notes here. With so many other cases like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Dante Wright, so many others that are still waiting to be into court and get their day in court, you feel like this verdict is going to open the floodgates of justice, so to speak, that they have a better chance or an improved chance of winning their case because now they've shown you actually can beat the court, you can win against the police. Do you think this is going to make a difference in those cases or just be the same, just going against the actual evidence there? What do you think, Eric?
I think it's going to open up a door where there's a greater likelihood that law enforcement officers who are criminally charged in situations similar where they've used force, I think it's going to open up a door for more law enforcement officers to be found guilty as charged. And my caution to those people who are in that end of the criminal justice system is forget about the George Floyd case and go back to what you know to be true. Try it according to sound evidence, understanding our motto in this country with the statue of the woman holding the scales wearing a blindfold, and that is the woman of justice, and justice is blind. It only goes based upon the weight of the evidence, not upon playing favorites, not upon who's black or white, not upon who's a cop and a citizen, not upon who's male or female. Justice is blind to everything except for the truth and the evidence that is weighed, that a door has been opened that's going to increase the likelihood that officers will be tried criminally, and those criminal charges will be, that they will be found guilty of those criminal charges. Because in my opinion, George Floyd's death was tragic. And yes, Derek Chauvin, I think definitely manslaughter, because I find it hard to believe that even if it is in Minnesota's Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission for them to train officers that it's okay to restrain a subject by putting your knee on his neck, in my opinion, that's poor judgment. To have 3 officers on scene and an officer need to place his knee on a person's neck. I wasn't there. I've only seen video. I've only heard testimony. I've only seen story. But to me, that seems to be poor judgment, especially when the individual goes unconscious. Even if you believe the individual's playing possum, there's certainly enough of you there to take your weight and place it on other areas of the body to restrain him until the fire rescue paramedics get there and can take custody of him. The necessity for placing the knee on the neck, I just need that explained to me more, because I don't agree with it.
Thanks, Eric, for taking us through that pace and what your thought process would be as you're looking at the video and the evidence you've seen. And I know we've all seen the tape by now. We've all seen what's happened. It all boils down to this final question, and this is going to be going to everyone, both of you, as we look and close this discussion. And again, thank you guys for taking the time to do this. I think most of us in our mind are saying, okay, we've seen this. The case has been won. The verdict is guilty. Can this be a real monumental space for change? Can it really bring about police reform? And what does that look like from your point of view, from our point of view? What does real police reform look like? Eric, can you speak on that first, and then we'll get to Bishop. Eric, what do you think?
As I've said in the past, police reform would have to go all the way back to the academy, where those men and women who are getting involved in the academy are trained to have an idea of just who it is they are as police officers and what it is they do. And that idea must be contiguous through their training at the agency, when they're in field training, through the example of their field training officers, and then through the culture of their agency that says, this is the way we do policing. We do it fairly and squarely. We take the tools that we are given, we take the law that the legislatures has provided for us, and we hit the streets and we police our jurisdictions in ways that, again, like justice being blind, it's fair across the board for everyone who is within our jurisdiction. They will receive fair and equal treatment, period. So I believe that police reform begins there, but it also begins with a campaign for chiefs of police to send the message to all of those people listening and who may become thinking about getting involved in law enforcement, that this is who we are. These are the type of individuals, men and women, we want applying to our agency. And those people with other thoughts are not those people who we want even to make application with our agency, because any old days or any poor police tactics or mentality, those ways are gone. This is the new way. This is the proper way. This is the way we've been doing it for those doing it the right way. We just want to make sure that we communicate that message to all of those who are interested or involved currently with law enforcement in this country.
And I can understand that, but I think my question goes even further: is can they weed out the bad apples? I mean, every precinct, every city has some bad cops in it, and I think if we really want to get down to nitty gritty to start over, can they get rid of them? Can they actually put together a program that can weed out the bad ones so we can keep the good ones? Is that even possible?
I think I think that there can be a way to significantly mitigate those officers in the agency, because if you got, let's say, the state level passed down, whoever's in charge of law enforcement statewide passes it down to all law enforcement agencies, that there's certain standards that are going to be put in place, certain behaviors that are going to be monitored and tracked. And when we have officers whose conduct is demonstrating that they did something questionable, there will be type of either classes, or there will be a type of course or what have you that officer must be subjected to. And then that officer again will be tracked. His performance will be tracked to see if that he has a pattern of this. And if it's been established, if there is a pattern, he's not changing, that officer will be asked to step down from his position. I think that reform is certainly possible, especially in this climate. But I want to say this before we end the interview, and that is, as tragic as the George Floyd incident was, for those people who haven't already realized this, let's please understand that Derek Chauvin and those other two officers weren't prowling the streets looking for George Floyd or a George Floyd. George Floyd was a criminal. He was involved in criminal behavior. I believe he had been arrested 9 times previously, and he was in the process of committing a crime when the officers arrived at the scene. And so we have to be cognizant that individuals bear personal responsibility for their conduct that brings them into contact with law enforcement officers. Yes, the officers are the paid professionals who regardless must conduct themselves properly according to a standard. However, there is a standard for the citizens of our nation and the citizens of Minnesota and the citizens of Florida, where I'm at, or Alabama, or North Carolina, in the manner in which they are to conduct themselves if they wish to remain free citizens of that state. And if they don't conduct themselves accordingly, they may have interaction with those who will hold them accountable. So George Floyd and the girl with the knife and many others are not completely innocent because they were doing something that brought them into contact with law enforcement. And as
Understood.
Romans 13 says, that they are God's ministers of justice, and that they do not hold the sword for nothing. So.
Okay, I hear you, Eric. I hear you. Let's lean over to Bishop and see what he's got to say. Bishop, is police reform, in your eyes, in your mind, actually possible? Can they change the system? What do you think?
It is possible. And I think that, once again, we're given with a situation where it's brought to light. But you know what? It should have started with Rodney King and long before then. Now that we have a political will to go around it, every department must be looked at, and every foundation of our society needs to be looked at from a righteous eye, not a political or a biased eye. And the only righteous eye that we have is from the Word of God. And if we would look at every fundamental of society that we have and root out and reform the entire society, is what we need. If the animal is hot, then let's go ahead and let's do what we need to do. Let's do the reform, and it needs to be done. And let's just not talk about it and move on to another subject. It should be done there. It should also be done again in the homes. It should be done in the homes when we're raising our children too, because that's not going. He's going to always have somebody he's got to deal with, as long as moms and dads are not teaching them the respect of individual lives.
And with that last statement from Bishop, I'm going to close the program. I'm so glad that you guys took the time to kind of stop and reflect and help us to see some different points of view from this particular verdict. I know that we've been talking about all the things that have happened in between. But I wanted to present a more open, accurate, even if you will, a non-biased approach to say, hey, these are the things that are in front of us. And there's no, I don't want to say this is right or wrong, or this is the way, or that is the way. I want you to be able to sit for yourself and digest and recollect the thoughts that we talked about today and make some decisions on your own. But my point of over all of it is to say, hey, let's do something. This situation that happened, this guilty verdict, does have some implications. And if we can dive in together and figure out what can we do in our own separate sphere, our own separate lives, so to speak, to continue the momentum forward in a positive way, then this verdict will resonate and it will be an instrument of change. But if we do nothing and just say, hey, it happened, move on, it was such a terrible waste of someone's life who died unjustly. And we want to make sure that that person who passed away, that George Floyd, who's lost his life, lost it for a purpose. So let's make some change from this verdict, guys. Let's put some momentum behind it. Let's, as Bishop said, let's take action and move forward. Hope this segment helps someone today. As always, put your thoughts in the comments below. And I look forward to seeing all of you again at the next Beautiful Now Live podcast. Have a great one.